Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of Bira and Sira. Oh, well, Vira, sorry. Now I'm making mistake already from the very beginning. Before we start, I'm just very curious because I got asked this question in the past 2 days. So I want to ask this back to you. How has Bira and Vira conference so far been influencing the way you shower and what you think during your shower? People ask me that if you attended day 1's open keynote, so I'm really curious what you would say to me. Please let me know after this. So hello everyone again. My name is Yu Wei. I work at the University of Nottingham. However, academically, I was made in Glasgow, and I was half made by our keynote today, Professor Michele Schweisfurth. So that's why I got asked to chair the session, the keynote today by Mari. Although my budget editors think the reason why you got me to chair is because you find it difficult to pronounce Professor Schweisfurth's surname. Actually, I still remember Michele told me when I was doing my PhD that I was one of the very few people in the world that can actually properly pronounce and spell her surname well. I don't know if I'm still that special for her because it's been about a decade and you know, this is a changing world. So she might get some other people who has become more important and special in her life. But I'm very honored by all means to be chairing this session. And I was a little bit nervous yesterday when I got the task, and I even went to ChatGPT trying to find out what ChatGPT says about Michele and how she was introduced there. I mean, you know all the sense about how it was talking about Michele being a distinguished scholar in international and comparative education. She's been the 2023 and 2024 president for the British Association for International Comparative Education. She is well known for her research on global education policies, pedagogy, international development. So all those kind of things which you can also see from the introduction bio of Michele on the Bira app and introduction. So I'm not going to repeat that, or actually I have repeated that already. But I just want to share 2 stories about how Michele influenced myself and which probably may relate to a lot of other people, like how Michele's work has influenced them, which I think that's one thing ChatGPT still hasn't been able to do. Like they don't tell stories like we do as humans. So that's how I'm going to introduce Michele. So the first one, how Michele influenced my work was when we wrote an article together in 2022. That has really changed the way I write academically. The reason for that is, you know, after the training from PhD and also I always got banded to write a paper in a traditional and conventional way that we have always to describe the theoretical framework and what that is and how that has been underpinning our research. But let me show in that paper has taught me another way of writing, which is telling the story. Again, about stories, like how to state the problem first and then put it into context and what is already known from existing knowledge and tell us what we did in this paper and how we achieved to present our argument without explicitly describing the theoretical framework we've been using, but it's everywhere. It underpins the argument, it underpins the way we tell the story, it also underpins it's even reflected in the languages we use. So now that I become an editor for journals, and a lot of times I read so many articles that always have a separate theoretical framework session describing that without necessarily actually using that to inform interpretations of findings or to inform their arguments. I so wish they could all have a Michele in their life to inspire them and teach them how to write a proper academic article. Not proper, sorry, just like a good way of writing. So that's the first influence that I really get from Michele. The second one is relating more closely to her work in terms of international comparative education. So in my past years, the work I do has always have this in comparative lens, particularly between the global north and the south, and even challenging this binary of global north and south itself in my research, which has been inspired by Michele. And I find it really helpful to take this comparative lens, not because we want to compare like how different systems or how different countries are better than the other, but through this kind of comparative lens, it has been able to disrupt some of the oftentimes assumed universalization in educational research and also in education more broadly. For example, many of the international policies, even the Sustainable Development Goals. So I see myself now more critically engaging with the Sustainable Development Goals because we don't think it is representing a diversity of experiences or context in our world, and it has assumed a kind of universalization across countries and contexts. So that's one important part underpinning my research, which has come from the inspiration of Michele. And one example into that is closely related to today's topic, pedagogy as well, because there's a lot of things about culturally relevant pedagogy, culturally sensitive pedagogy, culturally responsive pedagogy. More recently, I wrote a paper which we propose culturally reflective pedagogy. But again, so many different terms, and that's again inspired by Michele's work, where she starts talking about like culturally situated pedagogy, and also particularly focusing on how different levels of context, national, local, global, are coming together to shape and influence pedagogies and like what pedagogies are for in our education and in education research. So that's how the two ways Michele has influenced my work, and I'm really looking forward to getting further inspired today by her keynote. So I'm handing over to Professor Michele Schweisfurth.
Thank you very much, Yue. Of course you are still special to me. And Barbara. And we're very proud. We can't take any credit, but we're very proud. Yeah. And thank you for that introduction. And thank you very much to Bira for the invitation to speak this morning. I'm very honored. And in my talk this morning, I will be building on some of the ideas that I've heard floating around the conference, including some of the ideas that Liesl was putting forward in her keynote, but things I've been hearing in the parallel sessions as well, about ecosystems, about contextualization, and about good practice. But I'm going to be focusing very specifically on pedagogy. And I'm going to start with a confession. My title is a little bit mischievous because I suspect that one or two people in the room are thinking, aha, now we're going to get the answers about pedagogy. And I can only apologize if you're hoping for a very clear answer about what good pedagogy looks like or what constitutes best practice, then I'm sorry you will be disappointed. But hopefully you will learn something anyway. What I will be doing is starting with two anecdotes, because everybody loves a story, right, Yue? And then progressing to a definition. I will be unpacking a theory in 3 different ways, and then I'll be talking about research communities that do work on pedagogy and how they do or do not operationalize that theory, and why that matters and how that affects what we've learned and what we haven't. So I won't be talking very much about best practice. What I'll really be doing is troubling the idea of best practice and the universal ideas that sit behind that. So I'm going to start with a couple of anecdotes, and both of these anecdotes are from my PhD research, which for some of you will feel like ancient history because I did it in the late 1990s. So The contexts have changed. You might not see exactly these things happening anymore, but I think the issues that these anecdotes raise are still relevant. So, my PhD research in the late 1990s was set in South Africa and Russia as a comparative study. And you're probably sitting there going, South Africa and Russia, what do these places have in common? But in the late 1990s, both of these countries were working towards democracy, right? South Africa was emerging from apartheid, and Russia was emerging from communism. Both were emerging from a non-democratic regime, and both were using education policy to try to facilitate that. And those policies set out new roles for teachers and new ideas of what good classroom practice looked like. So, now this is a not untypical African classroom. These are just generic photos from stock. And the situation is a frontal kind of arrangement of the seating with a teacher at the front, you know, and some interaction, but the teacher clearly being in charge, and a lot of important information on the blackboard. Well, when I was doing my PhD, what I did was I used individual teachers as case studies. I talked to them about what their intentions were. I observed their classes. Then I talked to them about what happened in their classes, and I talked to them about their life history and how they felt about the changes going on. So most of the classes I saw in South Africa, certainly the historically black classes, were set up like this, and the pedagogy looked like this. And one day I met a new teacher that I was going to be working with, and I saw before the children arrived that the whole room was set up in groups. I thought, aha, something new, something different. We're going to see some learner-centered practice here, some group work. And so I started by asking her, so tell me about the classroom arrangement. You know, the kids are going to be sitting in groups. Why is that? And she said, well, I went to a workshop a couple of weeks ago, and we were told about this modern pedagogy where we are supposed to be more learner-centered and children are supposed to do more collaborative work. Okay, great. Julie noted that down. Then the class started, and she stood at the front and lectured and wrote things on the blackboard, very much like this situation, except half the children in the room couldn't see. I'm going to give you these anecdotes, and then I'm going to park them, and we're going to come back to them. Second, this is a Russian classroom in the late 1990s. Again, not my research pictures. I can't ethically use those, although at the time ethical processes were easier. But the classrooms looked very much like this, children usually sitting in twos, facing the front. And I went to a few classrooms, and in every single one of them, at the end of each lesson, the bell would ring, the children would, the teacher would say the lesson is over, the children would put their books in the outer edge of the front of their desks and sit up straight like this. And I thought, well, this is interesting because everywhere I'm going in my research, these teachers are doing this same ritual. And I eventually thought to ask one of the teachers, you know, why do you do that? Why is it that everyone's putting the books, you know, and she said, do what? What do you mean? What do you mean? I mean, doesn't everybody do that? You know, doesn't everybody in the world do that? I wasn't really thinking about it. I mean, my teachers did that. My teachers' teachers did that. You know, is this unusual? Why are you even noticing this? Okay. So what I'm suggesting is that these two anecdotes have something in common, but there's something quite different about them as well, and I will come back to them. So I'm going to go on to a definition now. And this is a definition by Robin Alexander, who was my PhD supervisor, Yue's PhD grandfather, and Yue's PhD student's great-grandfather. And his definition of pedagogy, which is widely used, is that pedagogy encompasses both the observable act of teaching and the theories, beliefs, and debates which underpin it. So basically, it is both what we can see, the teaching methods, but also everything behind it that drives it. And we can think about that observable pedagogy as actually being the tip of the iceberg, because there's a whole load of stuff going on in teachers' heads, in policy, in wider society, that is shaping what we can actually see. So the question I want to think about today is, how do all of those work together? How do those observable techniques plus all of that other stuff behind them, how do those fit together? And what if there's incoherence in some part of the system? And I'm going to talk about 3 different theories which come to very similar conclusions. And this is the kind of thick and text-heavy part of the presentation. I'm going to start with a theory that I've used, which is the pedagogical nexus. And this was a theory that was actually born out of research in Russia. And what was noticed was that descriptions of what happened in classrooms in Russia from decades, even centuries before, very much resembled what was happening in the late 1990s. And so there was this incredible continuity of provision over time, over space, and this was across Russia as well. I mean, Russia is a massive place. And we were seeing very similar things, and similar things were reported over time. Remarkable consistency. And what Houghton and Eliot proposed was what they called the pedagogical nexus, because what they saw was all of these things behind the techniques all fitting together. The policy, the cultural ideas about what good pedagogy consisted of, the curriculum, the textbooks, the assessment, the way that children were prepared for school, the way they moved through school, all of these created a really tight web that fit together and actually made it very difficult to change things, and that created this continuity. Similar theory with a slightly different emphasis, Rapalai and Komatsu talk about the ontocultural context for pedagogy. And this emerged out of their study of Japanese pedagogy and Japanese lesson study, which didn't seem to work so well in the US. And their explanation was that it was this tight relationship, again, that kind of interwoven nature of pedagogy with its environment, the cultural environment. So there were certain cultural norms that shaped what happened in classrooms, and then what happened in classrooms then reinforced those cultural norms. Yeah? So things like teachers letting children get on with things in a big classroom, and learning responsibility and working together to solve problems was, in their analysis, a way of emphasizing this collective nature of teaching and learning and the wider society in Japan. So they learn to be part of the group in that way, and then that reinforces Japanese culture. And without those sorts of dispositions, trying to take that idea of lesson study, which demands a collaborative spirit, a collective approach to teaching and learning, it won't work. So when it was imported to a more arguably individualistic culture, it wasn't so successful. And finally, there are various versions of systems thinking, and one of the more current ones is from Fowle and Savage, from their work in trying to implement pedagogical change in the Global South. And they argue, as others have, that there are no silver bullet solutions to any of this, that it's not a technical issue, and that the education systems are complex. There are many, many moving parts. And complexity is a really important concept. I think we sometimes use it quite almost lazily without thinking about it. But complexity is different from, if something is complex, that's different from it being complicated. It means that you can't quite predict how things are going to work, because one thing will influence another that will then influence another, and there's no mathematical model complicated enough in the world to explain what makes teachers do what they do, the impact that that has on children, and then how those children are going to take that forward in their lives. So they talk about this in terms of development work on education and note that single levers will not suffice for predicting or implementing systemic change. Systemic change is a very complex, long process that demands a lot of engagement with a lot of different stakeholders. So what do all of these have in common? All of these ultimately point to an ecosystemic nature of education systems. And you used the term ecosystem in the first opening session. And this tight relationship between Alexander's two-sided definition, all the ingredients of it, they aren't just separate ingredients, they all work together. Now that's in fairly stable systems, right? But where there is policy transfer from one system to another, we might not get that coherence. We might get what has been called tissue rejection, right? Like when you try to transplant an organ into a body, but the body rejects it because it doesn't fit organically into the body. Now, let's think back to those anecdotes. Let's start with the Russian one. Neither of those teachers, either in South Africa or Russia, really understood why they were doing what they were doing, but for completely different reasons. In the Russian case, this had been so embedded in their way of thinking about teaching and learning that they couldn't even see it anymore, right? It was like a fish doesn't see the water. You know, it was so deeply enculturated. It's what they'd experienced. It's what they'd sort of understood. And so on one level, it was just a kind of habit. But on another level, it was more complicated than that because this served a number of purposes, right? It was actually a very strong signal about who owned the time in that lesson. The teacher owned the lesson. Yeah, and the lesson wasn't over until the teacher said it was over, and the students did what the teacher said, which was put the books on the side. Now, when the teacher said, the bell had already rung, right? But when the teacher said, "Okay, now you can go," all hell broke loose, right? If you've ever been in a Russian classroom, in a Russian school, in between classes, they're tearing up and down the corridors, and because the students own that time. And this simple ritual of placing the books had this role of emphasizing the shift in the power over the time from the teacher to the students. And it also, had this intergenerational continuity function. You can imagine all these children going home and saying, "Babushka, today in class we had to put our books on the side. Oh yes, that is correct. That is how it should be." And you have that reinforcement at home of how things have always been and how they should be. On the other hand, in the South African case, a quick and dirty workshop trying to change practice towards more learner-centered practice didn't have the same effect. It had a very superficial effect, right? I'm going to move some desks around, right? And then my pedagogy will be more modern. But actually, changing those deeper levels of teacher practice, the stuff beneath the iceberg, takes an awful lot more work because those techniques are completely superficial and don't actually drive pedagogy and don't drive learning. So in some ways, even though both of those examples have things in common, they are very, very different. And I've done a lot of work on a particular traveling policy, which is learner-centered education. And this started from my PhD work. I was trained as a teacher in Canada. I went to Canadian schools before that. I was a complete advocate for learner-centered education. I went around the world working in places like Sierra Leone and Indonesia and telling people this is what they should be doing. And it was when I started seeing how difficult it was to change practice in Russia and South Africa, even though teachers were keen on democratization. I started to think, hang on, this is a little bit more complicated. And that inspired me to do a review of the literature on implementing learner-centered education. And in the late 1990s, virtually every single country in sub-Saharan Africa mentioned learner-centered pedagogy in their educational policies. I mean, that is an extraordinarily powerful traveling policy. And yet, when you look at the research literature on the impact that those policy changes had, we see again and again this tissue rejection, where the change did not happen, or at least it didn't happen in the expected or desired ways. So, I mean, that could happen for a lot of reasons. There is one argument that I'm a bit agnostic about. I don't know how I feel about it. There is an argument that it is fundamentally a Western concept that does not fit in those contexts, that it is a cultural mismatch, that it is disrespecting indigenous ideas of good pedagogy and indigenous ideas of teacher-learner power distance. I don't know, I think that's complicated. I think cultures do change and pedagogies do change. I mean, people were still getting the strap in my primary school when I was growing up, and things do move on. Cultures aren't static, but I still think that's an interesting argument. Another argument is that this is simply a problem of implementation, that too many people were sent off for 1 or 2 day workshops without enough attention to how you really integrate those new practices and those new ways of thinking about pedagogy. There's certainly some of that. Sometimes it could be about incoherence. I mean, in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, you get classes of 90, 100 children, even more, and you're supposed to individualize your pedagogy under those circumstances. That is a challenge that teachers certainly find extremely difficult, but also a lot of places where learner-centered pedagogy was mentioned in policy. One thing that didn't change was high-stakes tests, right? So you have this incredible incoherence. You've got this very high-stakes assessment, which determines your life chances, and in many cases asks you basically to just tell what you've memorized under test conditions. And yet classrooms are supposed to be learner-centered and encourage critical thinking and opening people's minds and so on. And you can imagine which wins. Which do you think won? The high-stakes test or the policy? Yeah, we know. The tests always win, don't they? Yeah? And we see this backwash effect of high-stakes testing again and again in many places where learner-centered education was encouraged. And you know, in some places the change was just kind of benignly ignored or implemented in little ways, in little mediated ways. But, you know, we'd have to say that in that South African case, the anecdote that I started with, it made things worse, right? Because we've got the same pedagogical approach, but half the kids can't even learn that way because they've got their backs to the board. Right. These are not new ideas to comparativists. Any comparativists in the room? A few, yeah. So comparativists have been banging on about this for a long, long time. I mean, back in 1900, Michael Sadler said, "We cannot wander at pleasure among the educational systems of the world like a child strolling through a garden, pick off a flower from one bush and some leaves from another, and then expect that if we stick what we have gathered into the soil at home, we shall have a living plant." Right? So even back in 1900, we're seeing these organic metaphors for education systems and the impossibility of simply transplanting something into this organism and expecting it to thrive. So what have we learned? I mean, fast forwarding a little bit in terms of how we research in a context where this context of pedagogy is so important. I did a study with a couple of colleagues back in about 2020, and we were looking for comparative articles on pedagogy. We mapped a number of things about them. We also mapped whether they were focused on the process of pedagogy or whether they were focused on the outcomes, and whether they operationalized context as an ecosystem or whether they operationalized the context for pedagogy as a set of variables. So, something like size of the class, poverty of the community, etc., rather than thinking about the whole nexus together. And the research generated this. So we created a matrix, right? So we had on one axis, we've got the process-focused, outcome-focused, and on the other axis, we've got variable-oriented and ecosystem-oriented studies. And as you can see, there are scattered kind of studies all over the place, but there are two quadrants that are quite powerful, right? With some large numbers, the bigger the bubble, the more the studies. So we can see that Group A, the variable-oriented and outcome-focused group, has quite a few studies in it, including some that are extremely oriented that way. And in the other group that we see quite a lot of studies in is process-focused and ecosystem-oriented. So interested in pedagogy as a process rather than the outcomes it generated, and thinking about the context of pedagogy as an ecosystem. So the articles in Quadrant B had a number of things in common, as well as being in that quadrant. They tended to reference the standards agenda, they referenced the learning crisis, they used that crisis discourse. They were looking to intervene to improve outcomes, so you had some variables to manipulate. They used quantitative methodology, obviously, if we're talking about variables, and they were often funded by aid agencies or national governments. This is where the money was, right? Looking for solutions, variables, quantitative, intervening, outcomes focused on learning rather than process. And then the articles on the other quadrant were more qualitative, interpretive, sometimes even more theoretical, culturalist, self-funded, a lot of very small-scale studies where people didn't actually have any funding, or by research councils. And they were less oriented towards making recommendations. Their primary idea was to contribute to knowledge about pedagogy. But what was also interesting was that they were different planets. They weren't even referencing the same literature. They almost seemed to be talking about completely different things, right? Even though they were all concerned with pedagogy, they were doing it in such different ways and with reference to such different agendas and such different bodies of literature that they just seemed absolutely poles apart. And this led me to think about these quadrants as potentially epistemic communities. And Haas's idea of an epistemic community is a community where there's a shared set of beliefs that provides a value-based rationale. So there's a kind of normative underpinning. So you would say that for the quantitative studies that are focused on outcomes, this is driven by an importance of solutions, a need for learning, a need for validity, because the shared notion of validity is another definition of an epistemic community, shared causal beliefs, and a common policy enterprise and set of practices. So I've argued elsewhere that these are two distinctive epistemic communities that are thriving in the study of pedagogy, but living on different planets in the study of pedagogy. And I've called one what works. I'm not the only person who's called that what works. That's a fairly common term. And the other I've somewhat hesitantly called what connects, because they are trying to connect pedagogy to culture and trying to connect the different parts of the context together so that it becomes a more ecosystemic, kind of integrated way of thinking. And in a forthcoming book, I develop those arguments more. That's the ad. It's over now. You'll be glad to know. But as I said, the money and the influence tends to follow the what works community. So, for example, there is a Global Education Evidence Advisory Panel, which actually categorizes different interventions as great buys or goodbyes, as in kind of sort of pseudo-Tesco language. Programs, these are classed as programs that are highly cost-effective with a strong evidence base. And what they mean by strong evidence base is RCTs. They talk about teachers in terms of quality teachers, as kind of essentializing a teacher as an ingredient, that is quality or not quality within this pedagogical frame. And World Bank Teach is a World Bank initiative, which is a lesson observation form, which is allegedly more or less universal, which generates information about the kind of links between what teachers are doing and student outcomes and so on. And this is where the money is. So what? So we've got these two different communities. So the money is following one. Should we be worried about this? I think we should. And I think the problem is that what works doesn't work. We know that traveling pedagogical policies rarely become embedded as planned. So any kind of attempt to find a universal that can be implemented in more or less the same way in different contexts is going to be futile. There is also quite a strong school of thought that is argued, I think, quite coherently, that research findings on education, on pedagogy, from quasi-experimental methods like RCTs, rarely generalize well. They are very rigorous in themselves. To do an RCT, and I've been involved in projects that have done RCTs, it's really rigorous. You have to be so careful with the little stuff. But the big stuff about how generalizable it is beyond the context of the actual RCT is another question. And many of the current interventions that we see being rolled out in the Global South, such as structured pedagogy and teaching at the right level, these are not single pedagogies. These are kind of bits and pieces that have been known about for a long time, already known to be or believed to be effective, but we don't really understand how they work in these packages, and their impact is hard to understand. So these are being rolled out as kind of panaceas, ready off-the-shelf solutions, do teaching at the right level, which is basically differentiated group work, right? And there is really strong RCT evidence that this does improve learning, but this RCT evidence doesn't ask, for example, what are the other effects of putting children in ability groups? Because RCTs test what they test. They don't look at the big picture. And structured pedagogy is basically teacher guides, right? Nothing new there, but it's being rolled out as a whole way of governing and controlling what teachers do. In the extreme cases, it becomes almost like a scripted lesson. But we know that teacher guides have been around for a long time, and some are better than others, right? It completely depends on the quality of the teacher guide and how the teacher feels comfortable in using it in order for it to have any impact. But the other problem is that what connects doesn't connect, because it doesn't really engage with this issue of learning. I sometimes have a real problem with this crisis discourse that's out there. I find it paints a very deficit picture of the kind of learning that goes on in the Global South in particular. I'm troubled by that, but it doesn't mean that learning's not important. And it doesn't mean that outcomes don't deserve equal attention. Foundational learning is another big emphasis for the what works camp, so the basics of reading, writing, mathematics. And, there is good evidence that these are important building blocks. And if we don't focus on those, if we focus on other things exclusively, things will be lost. And, the reality of the moment is that resources are following the what works agenda. That's not going to change in a hurry. So if we want a seat at the big table, we're going to have to work with and across those communities. in order to understand the full breadth of how context is shaping pedagogy, but also how pedagogy does lead to outcomes, including outcomes, but not only outcomes in the basics. So I would say that if there's one thing that I've learned, it's that there aren't any silver bullets, with my apologies if that's what you were hoping for. But what I have learned is that we really do need to work hard at the inter-epistemic and interdisciplinary collaborations. Yeah? And we're a long way from that at the moment. So, thank you very much. And I'm hoping you've got some questions. There are some references which I can put up later or send.
Thanks so much, Michelle. I think some of my hanging thoughts in terms of the globally universal standards of pedagogy and the cultural relevance and things are being consolidated a bit based on what you have just said. So now it's time for me to manage my supervisor and choose who can talk to her. So please, if there are any questions from the audience or comments and thoughts. Yes, please. Oh, someone is coming. Okay.
Thank you for offering to come and give me the mic in the first instance. I'm Ane Nangliam from the University of Oxford. Professor Schweisfurth, thank you so much for that insightful and engaging talk. I'm curious about your understanding of this tension between the contextual and the universal for our profession. And given the increasing international mobility for teachers and teacher educators, combined with what seems to me a lack of consensus in a professional knowledge base for teaching and teacher education, combined with the focus I feel on the increasing tendency towards context-specific and situational pedagogies, what do you feel, if anything, unites us as a profession, if not at the value of pedagogy, then perhaps at the level of values? And I was intrigued by a comment about teachers who didn't know why they were doing what they were doing. And I suppose to reframe these thoughts in theoretical terms, I'm curious about your views about the ontoculture of our profession. Thank you.
Right. That's a very substantial question. Does our profession have an ontoculture? I think that there are different cultures of teachers in different contexts as a start. I think that motivations for joining the teaching profession vary in different places. One of the realities of the teaching profession in many parts of the global south is that it's not people's first choice. So what does that do in terms of shaping the ontoculture? But what we can do is work with those motivations, wherever they come from. And I think we have to think about the profession not only as being situated in its own context, but not all teachers having the same capacities and having the same motivations, even in the same context. So there are teachers who would thrive with a really good teacher guide that doesn't necessarily script their lessons, but actually gives them something to lean on. And then you can actually learn through doing something, right? So if you are given a kind of set of lesson plans that you can follow, that can be an introduction. I don't know how many people in the room were actually teachers or are teachers, but I think when you're a novice teacher, you lean quite heavily on that stuff. And then as you progress, you learn to be more reflexive, you learn to think more deeply about why you're doing what you're doing, and you are able to think harder about what is fit for purpose on that rainy Wednesday in September in your class in Manchester, right? So I'm reluctant to characterize teachers in any particular way. I think there's plenty in the literature that is teacher bashing. I think there's plenty in the literature that sets out teachers as heroic. I don't think either is really true. Teachers are human. But I think that there is something about creating a kind of culture of teaching which encourages the development of reflection, encourages that questioning about why you're doing what you're doing. But we can't expect teachers to go from zero to that in a workshop, for example. That's a long-term cultural development in the same way that changing pedagogy is. So I hope that wasn't too meandering and spoke a little bit to your question, but thank you.
Thanks. Okay, can we go here first and then the lady next? Oops.
Thank you. Hua Hui from University of Leeds. I'm not in this area, but very inspired. Thank you very much. I conduct research in examination-oriented context, like in China, sometimes in Vietnam, and I totally agree how the importance of high-stake exam impact the change of the ontoculture, teacher practice when you introduce in the innovative method there. They really enjoyed it, and in the end, if you ask them, will you carry on doing it, they will say, nah, because it doesn't help your students' exam results. I'm not looking for solutions or your suggestions. I guess I'm looking for maybe some examples from your experience, how those teachers in an examination-oriented context try their different ways to maneuver through kind of the context. They can still have their flexibility, their imagination, creativity, but at the same time, they feel comfortable enough to still teach and help their learners with their exams.
Thank you. I think given how important standardized tests are in many systems, I think that's actually a really important question. People are sometimes surprised to hear that I've never done a standardized examination in my life. Yeah, you see what I mean? I grew up in Ontario. Every test I ever took was set by my teachers. And that was just normal. We didn't ask any questions about that. When I arrived in the UK eventually, what I was struck by was how decades after doing their tests, people were still traumatized by them and still talking about the grades they got on their A-levels, in their 30s. And how good they were at taking tests, because a lot of classroom time was used up in preparing people not just for the actual content and the questions, but for the process. The timings, what if your hand cramps? I mean, all that kind of thing, right? So I came at the idea of standardized testing from a, why would you do that point of view? But this is what drives a lot of systems. But we do, and I'm on thin ice here, because I think there's this idea that we all learn in the same way, that we're like kind of factory robots that have rolled off an assembly line with the same kind of brain wiring, and that we'll all learn the same way. But we learn to learn according to what drives the systems that we study in. People become very, very good at memorizing. I mean, people who are from China, who've prepared for the Gaokao, respect. I mean, my goodness, that is such hard work, the sheer volume. But there is also, and this is, again, I'm on thin ice, please correct me, I believe there is part of an understanding of that learning that it does go deeper than we sometimes think. We tend to think of rote learning as very shallow, and it certainly can be. But, there is a school of thought, which some of my Chinese students and colleagues have told me, that if you if you read 1,000 poems, you can write a better poem than if you just lean on your creativity and inspiration. So there is something to that repetition, that process, that hard work that not only helps you to pass your test, can help you to be creative. I think we need to open our minds about what good pedagogy necessarily looks like. But I think one thing's for sure, that when we do introduce new pedagogies into places that are driven by standardized examinations, we can't expect people to ignore those exams, because doing well on those exams are the priorities of teachers, because often they are judged by how well their students do on those exams. Their students are going to be thinking about their life chances. The parents are going to be concerned about how those children do, and the school leaders are going to be concerned because that's the reputation of the school, right? So how do you make space in a circle like that, a nexus like that, an ontoculture like that, a system like that, for innovations? And I think my kind of lazy answer is there's always wiggle room. Yeah? And there is some good evidence that certain kinds of learning are better facilitated by methods other than the kind of frontal teaching. And so we need to make space for those, but not expect some overnight transformation where the tests are still in place. But if we can demonstrate that somebody will do better on a test who has experienced a range, a repertoire of pedagogies, including some which rely more heavily on frontal teaching, but also including some which require more individual or collaborative work or creative work, then I think we're on to a winner. We're a little short on evidence on that. There's a lot of ideology behind what people consider to be good pedagogy. The actual evidence, which is across a lot of cultures, is a little thinner on the ground.
Sorry, that's a privilege of being the chair. I just want to ask a follow-up question in terms of the test. What if the test itself is about sorting people into different places and things, and also if there's something about that the test, like the purpose of pedagogy or teaching didn't specify in, for example, the hidden curriculum, that apart from the test itself, the function of a particular pedagogy or the education itself is also about citizenship education. For example, when you were talking about the reciting 100 poems, apart from that, you will be able to write beautiful poems. I'm also thinking how by doing that, there's also a hidden or the underlying values coming through this that comes into the pedagogy. So what do you think about this in terms of what it means to be pedagogy, a good pedagogy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, pedagogy is never just for one thing. The explicit purpose might be passing a test, but there are all sorts of other things going on in the para-curriculum, the hidden curriculum, which explicitly or implicitly teach us how to be human in the context where we are. And all of that, everything you say is absolutely true. I was a member of the International Panel for Social Progress. We had an education branch of the panel, and we set out a range of different potential purposes for education. There was the economic, the humanistic, the civic, the equality. I would add to that sustainability and well-being. But even the economists on the panel agreed that we focus too much on the economic. And this is often what is the kind of discourse behind the standards agenda, right? So when we see a drive for doing better in the basics, an emphasis on summative evaluation, often behind it, underpinning it, is this assumption about the economic agenda for education. But there are all of those other purposes, and even if you don't explicitly focus on those, they're going to happen. People are going to learn to be citizens, good, bad, or indifferent, through the humanizing process of pedagogy. One way of thinking about pedagogy is that pedagogy is a technique that leads to a certain outcome. Another way of thinking about pedagogy, and this is drawing on the work of Geert Biesta, is thinking about it as an encounter, like art. You can't force learning. It's more like showing someone a painting and they react to it. Yeah? And that will be a very different way of thinking about pedagogy, and whether we're thinking about it that way or not, that is happening, right? The students are not machines. They are taking in what's happening in the classroom in ways that are affecting them across all of those different goals.
Thanks. I've got the lady on the back. Yes.
Hi there. My name's Richard Home from the University of Dundee on the east coast of Scotland. So thank you for a great presentation. Lots to think about. Given the challenges and limitations of the travelling policy that you've talked about, and then not just now about the metric-based assessment-driven system, we focused on the learners. Should we be focusing more on the teachers and maybe their response to how they're compliant within this system? And if so, how do we do that?
Yeah, nobody's asking any small questions. Anybody got any easy questions? Yeah, I mean, I think, even within PISA, there are questions about pedagogy, but I would argue that you don't know pedagogy without being in the classroom and seeing it. People will report their pedagogy, or students will report particular pedagogies, but it doesn't necessarily look like that when you observe it. And so working with teachers, I think, is a very intensive process. I think it's more about mentoring. It's more about it's about that situated learning for teachers. It's not about gathering more metrics on teachers and deciding who's a quality teacher and who's not or whatever, but I think that teacher professional development is and people who work in this area will know this. This will be your bread and butter. That this is a lifetime process. This is a process of kind of walking with teachers through their practice. I think we spend so much time monitoring and evaluating teachers' work that time could be invested in supporting teachers' work, working with teachers, creating conditions for helping them to improve their pedagogy, not having pedagogical improvement forced upon them, but helping them to improve their pedagogy, thinking about what that would look like.
Thanks. And I apologize for the language I used just now. I have to be careful. I can only excuse myself by saying English is my second language. But sorry. I wish a colleague, colleague here, sorry.
Just very quickly, taken from what you just said a minute ago, support those teachers, walk in the steps they're walking, mentoring them, and then it's a lifelong process, providing some way that they can access appropriate CPD. I mean, those are the kind of things which to me actually means pedagogy. Supporting teachers to become better teachers and supporting teachers to value their students, their pupils, leading towards the learner-centered teaching. And the pioneers of learner-centered teaching, the Victorian teachers, there are two of them, their names I forget, Charlotte Mason and one more. And when they were trying to do pupil-centered teaching, they quickly discovered that they have to learn quite a bit about the kids. Listen to them, hear them laugh, listen to them when they are playing, find out what are the barriers to learning for those kids. Discover the barriers, and then find a helpful friend who can help you address those. Thank you for your comments. They've been very educational for me. Thank you. I am Birendra Singh from UCL, loosely connected with UCL.
The caveat there. Thank you for the comment and your kind words. I think it's probably worth signaling a couple of things about how resource intensive what I'm talking about is, right? We've already got places where they claim they can't afford to reduce class sizes, and we've got 100 students in the class, and now I'm saying we need to mentor teachers and walk them through their practice over a lifetime. Yeah, I mean, we also need to keep an eye on what kind of resourcing is possible for all of this and what models we can develop that are feasible. But absolutely, as an aspiration, I entirely agree.
Thanks. I think here and then, okay, yeah, and then three.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring talk. My name is Ramona Saroro, a PhD student at the University of Cambridge. I'm looking at teachers' professional learning and traveling policies. So my question builds on what you have just mentioned. I'm interested to hear your views on symbolic policies. And by that, I mean policies which do not allocate resources to what they promote.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think, those 1990s education policies where learner-centered education was mentioned in virtually every education policy in sub-Saharan Africa is a classic example of a symbolic policy, right? There was never going to be the investment needed to make that happen. So, I mean, symbolic policies serve a number of purposes. Who's the audience for that policy, right? Who was promoting learner-centered education in the 1990s? Well, some quite powerful players who would have been looking at those policies and saying, this is a good direction for you. Now, we can't look into the hearts and minds of policymakers. We can't know how serious they were, and they probably won't tell you. But we can look at the resources that they were actually prepared to commit, which were very low. And maybe that was because they seriously thought it would be easy, or maybe they just thought, well, it's important we get the right words in the right order in the policy.
And no. There. Sorry. Number 4.
Thank you. It works. My name is Marit Håvard. I am Norwegian. Thank you for a very inspiring talk. You were talking about interepistemic, interdisciplinary work is needed done. Maybe, I would say, probably also some intercontinental work here. Because, and it's always, and I have to say this, and I don't mean to be condescending, because it could sound like that, but just to give you an example, my position is a professor of pedagogy. You wouldn't have that in England. It doesn't exist. Because in my country, pedagogy is a discipline. And so I think, and this is part of my question here, and I think it goes to a lot of what happens in education in the Anglo-American world, is that trying to derive understandings of education through practice is important. It's necessary. And it's necessary to even to go the evidence-based way. Some of that is also needed. But it seems to me a lot of this research lacks a theoretical foundation. It doesn't have it. And I look through quite a bit of research. And very often there's a lack of theoretical foundation. So this is kind of my question into what you're talking about. How can we build that bridge? Because there is a very large, what do you call it? Corpora of educational or pedagogical literature. You could go to Italy, you could go to Spain, you can go to Germany, definitely where the whole notion of building is developed. All of Scandinavia has it. There's a rich literature, theoretical literature on pedagogy. But it seems like we are gradually forgetting it. And it's taken me a few years to realize that, being educated in it. So here I think we have a huge, we need some intercontinental work here, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think there is a very rich theoretical base, but I just don't think it's quite been kind of knitted together. And I think that, traveling theories are very different from traveling policies or traveling practices, aren't they? Traveling theories, are things that can be kind of integrated into whatever a pedagogical nexus is in a given context. It's very different from taking a technique and trying to move it somewhere else. So I completely agree that intercontinental work is really important. But just like the interepistemic work or the interdisciplinary work, it requires time and resources, right? And my concern is that at the moment, the resources are going into people they're going into the researchers who are seeking solutions that can travel, because that's seen as the most cost-effective way to work. This building of theory from the ground up across different disciplines, across, developing pedagogy as a kind of interdisciplinary discipline and working across different places is going to be, a very labor-intensive and resource-intensive thing to do. I'd love to see it happen.
The girl over there.
Thank you so much. My name is Nai, and I'd like to bring the topic back to China a little bit. So my question is about, because just as you mentioned, Gaokao is a very big exam that happens every year in China. And my question is about this, since this kind of goal that was set in all the students in China when they were very young. So my question is, so actually this is a kind of story because, I currently talk with a senior high student in China and asked him, what's your purpose to go to university? And he said, I don't know. He said, I don't know. And I asked, what's your ideal major in the future? What's your ideal job, ideal career in the future? And he said, this is a future question. I don't want to think about it right now. What I really want to think about is my school, is the way I could achieve university, is the way I could get a K to, a successful career. So my question is, how could we change, as a teacher, to help those students who had already held such kind of traditional, classical ideology inherited from the appearance, from the society, from a pedagogical perspective? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Another small question. It needs to start with motivation, doesn't it? Probably the teachers share the students' motivation. They went through the same thing. I think there is an intergenerational tendency, isn't there, that if you went through something, the next generation should as well. But I'm troubled by this thought that these kids are working so incredibly hard towards something and they don't really understand why. It's become an end in itself, passing this massive test without really thinking, because as Yue said, it's a very stratifying test. Which university you go to is going to be determined by your outcomes on this test. And yet they're not even sure why they want to go to university or what they want to study there. And I think there's a whole set of well-being issues, sustainability issues, civic issues that need to be tackled there. But that's a long project, because the first thing that has to happen is that teachers, that bottom of the iceberg, the invisible part of the iceberg, they need to see the test differently. So I would see that as a very long project. I think there's something here for teacher selection as well, but again, that requires motivation. People who select people for teacher education programs would need to be looking for those sorts of attributes. But do they? Well, possibly not. They probably look for people who are going to be good at exam preparation.
And what if because they don't know what to do, and then their parents tell them, especially for girls, that being a teacher is a good job. You have summer holidays, winter holidays. You can look after your family well, and then these people were told by their parents to become teachers, and then teach the next generations of the children.
Well, this speaks, I think, to Rapalai and Komatsu's idea of the ontocultural cycles of things, right? It just gets reproduced. So, how do you break that cycle? I mean, it is going to be a long project that's going to require probably interventions at various points in that cycle. And there's got to be the motivation for it. I don't see the Gaokao going anywhere in a hurry. I mean, it has its roots back in, old ancient Chinese examinations. So this is something that has a life of its own. So how do you change people's attitudes to it? I don't know, maybe if there's, I would not hope for unemployment anywhere, but maybe if people got a bit jaded about getting good exam results and then the work that led to, maybe that would be one way that the cycle could accidentally and not very, very helpfully be interrupted. And I think we're seeing a little bit of that in some places at the moment, with young people asking some serious questions about, why am I just on this education escalator here? What's the purpose of this? Why, I'm seeing the previous generation burning themselves out. Is that what I want? And maybe that's where it'll come from, if there are wider social changes that force people to think differently about the agenda that education has taught them is important, that could lead to changes.
Thanks. We've got the gentleman, the colleague there, and then here.
Yeah, thank you. It's Jack Whitehead, University of Cumbria in the UK. My question was focused on something that you ended with about different epistemologies, the epistemic communities. And I'm just wondering whether you've noticed in the kind of international work you've done that our communications as academics in the Western world focus literally on the English language. And I'm curious whether that very form of communication is masking what you might have noticed in relation to pedagogies which are actually embodied. And we need a very different way of communicating, probably through the use of visual data, because now the digital technology is really advanced. So could you just say whether you've noticed that as an issue, that your very form of communication as a Western academic, even in the here and now, is constrained by that logic and language of the Western academic community, which actually paradoxically might be masking the very educational knowledge, in particular the pedagogies, which are really significant to try to draw us together. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I haven't given it a lot of thought. I'm not a very visually oriented person. I've always, words have always kind of been my craft. And English is my first language. So, I am aware that the way that people talk about pedagogy in other languages is different for a start. So the hegemony of English in academic spaces where we talk about pedagogy is problematic in itself. But you're introducing another layer, which is apart from language completely. And I think that's really interesting. And I'm wondering how you would see that being operationalized. I think, I can imagine video or AI-generated images or more artistic expressions or whatever might be helpful. But you're...
No, it's just that your very presentation, it carries an energy. And It can be discriminate, you know, there can be a distinction, but you would actually focus on the nature of the embodied values, which in your case, as you've been communicating, seem to me to carry that relational dynamic of the values of human flourishing. So that's what I was suggesting might be an addition to what you've been saying.
Yeah, no, really, really interesting point. And I think it speaks to this distinction between pedagogical encounters and pedagogy as a technique. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your keynote. I've learned a lot today. And I'm Hadi Banat from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. I'm in the English department. My PhD is in rhetoric composition and teaching English for speakers of other languages. I direct the English as a second language program, and this is my 5th year there. So when I started working with the faculty in the ESL program, they've been there for a long time, so they're experienced teachers. I noticed that when I wanted to talk about pedagogy in professional development, they derailed me to talk about the curricular materials, the assignment design, the readings that we assign in the classroom. And I've spent, energy, working on that with them. And by curiosity, I wanted to get into the classroom, not to assess them because they're on continuing status, but to see, the pedagogical approaches within this community. And I've noticed that there's a discrepancy in the pedagogical approaches when it comes to effectiveness. And I took that back to professional development, but they are resistant to talk about pedagogy. Like they get back to the assignment design, thinking about, okay, the process of writing, and then I get back to the learning outcomes and the how-to and the process of writing in terms of pedagogy, and that's when we get stuck. So can you, what advice do you have for me or for teacher trainers to kind of overcome the tension between the official curriculum, the curriculum, and the delivery of the curriculum, which is more the pedagogy side?
Thank you. I don't have any great sage advice, but one conversation that I always find fruitful in almost every context where people haven't really started to unpack pedagogy is to ask people, who was your favorite teacher and why? And they don't start talking about, Ali was great because he gave really good tests, or there was a really, really good reader in grade 2, and, that teacher used it really well. They talk about that relational element of pedagogy. They talk about the actions. They talk about the activities. They talk about the stimulation. And that can sometimes help to open up those spaces. I think, again, in some contexts and more in some curricular subjects than others, the curriculum does drive a lot of pedagogy, but it doesn't drive all of it, and it doesn't have to. And I think getting people to think about the spaces where pedagogy does become important is actually a really good step. And everybody has a favorite teacher, right? And it can actually, such a simple question, right? We ask 7-year-olds, who's your favorite teacher, but we forget sometimes to ask adults, and that can really open up some interesting discussions.
You can ask me.
Thank you so much. I'm Dr. Lucy Caton from the University of Bolton, and I'm really interested in how you see generative AI playing a role in this sort of, I know there's not a magic bullet, is it, in this sort of ecosystem of pedagogy, and where you see its impact. And I like this idea of wriggle room as well, what advice you would give to create that space for CPD around that area.
I am probably really the wrong person to ask this. I have Perplexity on my mobile phone, and that's kind of the beginning and end of my engagement with AI. People tell me, who know more than me, that there is great pedagogical potential in AI if we embrace it instead of resisting it. If we try and frame AI out of the picture, it's futile. The genie is out of the bottle. But I'm not personally sure what that looks like. And what overwhelms me sometimes is that what that looks like seems to change every 5 minutes. So as we no sooner, and Trang and I were talking about this yesterday, we no sooner say, this is how AI could be used, and we start to take that forward and write the article and submit it. AI moves on 5 more leaps and bounds, and the way that we thought it could become pedagogically useful vanishes into thin air. I honestly don't know. I think we are at an incredible moment, but how that's going to unfold, I don't know. There will be resistance. There will be people who will try to frame it out of the classroom. I think that's going to have to break down quite quickly, but how we can use it fruitfully. The fact that you're asking the question intelligently probably means you probably know more about it than I do. But thank you.
We can take 2 more last questions, and then I think, yeah, this one. Oh, 3 more, okay. 2 colleagues here, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Michele, and I really enjoyed your talk. I like the clarity and the way that you built it up and brought us to the wonderful conclusion there is no best practice, and I've always felt that very sort of there's a sort of an underpinning all our teaching at the University of Gloucestershire, where I am based. Sorry, did I say my name is Paul Vare? And I am also the chair of a group called the National Association for Environmental Education. And you talked a lot about how, and this is really what's underpinning a lot of the role of education and pedagogy in driving it, the economic imperative. We're all in this neoliberal world, and that's what's happening, even if we don't surface it in our conversations. But there's another thing that's going to an imperative, which is climate change, and it's unraveling the fabric of this now. And neoliberalism has helped to bring us there. It's not solely responsible, but it's not helping. I'm just wondering about what that's going to do to education and to pedagogy. It might be there's a wonderful opportunity that we all suddenly have the similar context in that climate change is coming to all of us, but it'll play out very differently, of course, in different parts of the world. So perhaps there's an opportunity for some sort of pedagogy of hope and of emergency, but also is this a real danger that there might be again, just as I said about the silver bullet thing, I think, oh crikey, are we going to get a pedagogy for climate change, which everybody now has to do because we're all in the same boat? I'm just wondering about your thoughts on how things might play out with this emergency that's kind of happening now.
Yeah, really, really important question, and I think that one of the problems with the economic imperative driving things is that the economic imperative is also helping to fuel climate change. So, these things are working very much against each other. I think we can learn a lot from the pedagogies of indigenous people in places where there is a greater connection to the earth and the land. And there's some really interesting work by indigenous scholars in North and South America and in New Zealand and Australia on the pedagogy of connectedness to the land. And I think that we can all learn something from that. And it is a kind of learner-centeredness, but again, it's not a technique. It's about a particular set of values and about acknowledging that connection, that deep connection to the earth through all the work that we do in the classroom. As a connection to that. So I've lost the names, but there's some really interesting work out there. And I think in addition to the kind of intercontinental work that we could be doing around pedagogical theory, we could be doing some very interesting intercontinental and interepistemic work on pedagogy for a changing climate.
2 last questions. You first, yeah.
Yeah, me?
Yeah.
Thank you. My head is spinning because I'm connecting everything with the other keynotes on social justice, mental well-being, and also the question here of my colleague Nai, maybe optimistically as an early career researcher, looking for change, going into this field of trying to make a change. You mentioned the student movement, and we've seen recent examples of in Bangladesh where the student movement fantastically are not just asking for change, are making change. So, and also here locally, you know, on campuses, students are demanding for change. So I think, is it worth, and as a home educator, where in alternative education, we step out of the mainstream exactly for what the reasons you're mentioning, where we don't want to have tests, when we are child-led, child-centered learning. I'm wondering whether our lessons to be learned that actually instead of just only hearing student voices, we actually listen, and this conforming from an early career researcher to other positions where we become quite passive and quite happy to produce knowledge, but not actually enacting on it and supporting those who, like we heard now, that students actually, they see that test or assessment or our A-levels or UCAS points as the end of a means, not as this is just a means to an end. It shouldn't be our main target. Sorry. Complicated.
No, don't be sorry. I mean, I think that's a great point. I don't think there's any particular answer to it. I would just say that I agree that I think that, you know, change can come from a number of different directions, but one of the most promising is that, you know, it being driven by young people and children. And I think that, you know, this going forward, particularly in this context of rapid change that people like me are not keeping up with, you know, it's probably young people who are going to be our guides.
Sorry. In that case, I think that's the end of the keynote. I feel like thank you. This is way more challenging than any of the supervision meeting I ever had with Michelle. But thank you so much for this, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you for all your excellent questions and attention.